Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I am your host for today, Ben Thomas. Our conversation today centers around the GSOC. And when I say GSOC, I'm talking about a Global Security Operations Center and how maybe that differs a little bit from traditional setups like SOCs and NOCs, but also some of the unique applications, not only from a technology standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, and even some capabilities. And we've got three folks on today to have a conversation, to give us a little bit more insight and context into that conversation, starting first with our guest Tyler Bonner from Diversified, Dan Gundry from Barco, and of course, our expert guest for today, Ryan Schoenfeld from HiveWatch. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ben.
Well, look, I want to start here. You know, you go to shows like ISC West and GSX and so many of these different places kind of across our community. And one of the challenges, it seems, is as our community continues to expand, our terminology sort of gets used maybe in different places or different ways than it's supposed to, right? And one of those places is the term GSOC, right? I mentioned Global Security Operations Center, but people may not necessarily know the difference in a lot of those specific use cases and applications. So, Ryan, I want to ask you, as our resident subject matter expert in GSOC specifically, would love to kind of have you define that a little bit clearer for us, right? As somebody who knows the industry well and gets to interact with a lot of those folks and operators and decision makers on a regular basis.
Well, I certainly get to see a lot of control rooms. I don't think that there's a true definition for a GSOC. I know what I think a GSOC should be. And I'm not sure that I actually see a lot of true GSOCs in practice. I see a lot of security operations centers. I see a lot of guard dispatching rooms. I see a lot of facilities that do maybe intel monitoring and escalation and maybe mass communications. But the idea of a GSOC as being sort of the central hub, the nervous system of the organization, one that can take data from all these different endpoints, whether it's intel, whether it's corporate travel. Of course, everybody has video and access control systems. There's usually people and guard forces that need to be managed. And not only detecting the correct information and the things that are meaningful and impactful, but helping with the prioritization of those, the escalation of those, getting it through to a successful resolution, and doing that on a global basis. So like by definition, a GSOC, the G is global. And while HiveWatch gives out really comfortable GSOCs to wear on your feet, in the Dan can vouch, but but I see a lot of GSOCs in name, and then you go look at the function that they're actually providing, and it's not global, it's regional, or maybe it's specific to the facility that it's physically at. And then you're like, cool, let's talk about the tech stack, let's talk about the function, what are you actually doing? And the whole like integration, there's maybe disparate systems by way of access control and video, but they're not performing intel functions or sort of tying those things together. So,
well, that's an interesting point, Ryan. And Tyler, I want to kick you a follow up to that. You know, is it important for us to actually label these things correctly, right? As some of these terms become ubiquitous, how important is that terminology specifically, not only from an application and use case standpoint, but from you look at a service provider standpoint, is it important to segment those accordingly to their roles, or are you seeing things really kind of unify in the way that they're designed and built and set up?
I think it is important. And I think it's important because the mission that's being performed within those spaces is different. The way that these entities react to a trouble situation is different than a regional security operations center or a security operations center. So you can't try to support these GSOCs in the same way that you would handle potentially a security operations center. It's typically a different end user that's working inside those spaces. So the operators in there are a different type of employee versus a dispatch center, which is going to typically be manned by security operations folks or personnel. So I think you've got to understand as a partner to some of these customers what their mission is so that you can, again, adequately and accurately support their needs.
The correct staffing may be an interesting thing to come back to, but I think like, I don't really care what you call the room. And we've got some end users that have some pretty creative names for what they call the room. But like, as you think about the design, the layout, the technology, the function, like, what Tyler said is really important. Like the basis of design, what is the functional output of the room? What is the expectation? Like that needs to be really clearly defined, more so than whatever you're going to call it.
Ryan, I'm glad you brought that up, right? There's a lot of different ways to, I guess, define sort of the roles of a security operations center or a NOC or whatever. But I think when we talk about GSOC specifically, the thing that continuously stands out is that G, right? That global element, whether it's tracking employees internationally, monitoring international conflicts, monitoring, say I'm a multinational company, right? That global kind of lens, I think, is the most important part. And Dan, I want to ask too, as somebody who's seen really both sides of that world, right? Whether it's the integration side or the hardware manufacturer service provider side, what are some of the modern challenges that people are seeing? I mean, obviously post-COVID, everything's sort of changed, but what are some of the challenges now that some of these modern GSOCs are facing versus maybe even 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think, the world just feels weirder. First of all, most organizations now are doing more work globally. So just the nature of business has become more global. So we are seeing that aspect of things being boiled over. But the nature of the world, geopolitics, is just outrageous. I think it's probably at its worst level, at least in my lifetime. The unknown, the uncertainties, and the disruptions. I was just listening this morning about, some of the ongoing problems and struggles in China and Taiwan that are going to impact the technology industry in whole. Well, that's impacting all of our customers downstream. What's going over in the Middle East, what's going over between Ukraine and Russia, and then some of those more, let's call it regional problems that are happening. This is places where people are doing business. So again, kind of going back, it depends on the mission of your GSOC as to how much you're going to be impacted by the geopolitics that are going on, or just the regional or the global means of doing business. The concept of insider threat, the cybersecurity aspect of things, I think those continue to grow and become more mature in terms of the threats and the risks that they propose, kind of all of the above. And the problem is that things are changing on a daily, if not an hourly basis.
Ryan, I want to kind of take the same question and morph it a little bit, right? Especially in terms of when you think about globalization, there's all sorts of different compliance standards globally. I think that, depending on who you ask, the U.S. tends to be a little bit more lenient from a privacy standpoint, but that might create different challenges versus, someone like Europe and GDPR compliance and even, CCPA and things like that. There's all sorts of different compliance standards, but how does that apply kind of directly to the world of GSOCs, and does that make a difference from a global monitoring and data capture standpoint?
So I think the US can, in some cases, be more complex than other places because we don't have a national standard for how we do things. And like you referenced CCPA, that's a California specific law. And when you talk about biometrics, you look at states like Illinois, where using facial recognition, like even across the state, you can't have a standard. There's different jurisdictions within a single state that treat it differently. So what that means from a GSOC perspective, when you're trying to select enterprise grade technology that you can deploy on a global basis, it makes it very complicated to do so when you have to start factoring in all of the different privacy requirements that are involved region by region. And so you say, okay, well, this technology is not compliant in this jurisdiction and it's compliant this way, or we have to use it in a different way than we use it here, or employees have to proactively opt in to participate in this. But like if an employee doesn't opt in, then what do you do with that technology, and how do you actually deploy that on a global scale?
Ryan, you're right. There's sort of this amalgamation of different standards and compliances, and it isn't always easy to try and adapt, especially globally. But that same sort of challenge I think might apply actually from a technology standpoint. And Tyler, I want to ask, obviously you look globally and there's different standards from a technology standpoint, whether it's a power standard or even small things like NTSC versus PAL. What are some of those standards, or maybe even those technological challenges that you might run into on a global standpoint? And what are some of the ways that you're seeing folks really power through a lot of those?
Yeah, I think that we've really seen globally the standard for which we distribute content to really move towards standardized IP-based streams. So, and it's interesting, especially in a global security ops types of application, they're managing a lot of different types of data and a lot of different types of situations at any point in time. So the ability to disseminate that information within the function of the room or within the regional or a region throughout the regions of the world that are handling a potential crisis situation. It's really important that the technology is set up to enable that visualization, because, I mean, let's face it, we're visual beings. We learn by reading and seeing. So getting that data out visually to people so that they can be the most reactive possible is a really important piece. And I think that leveraging this global network that is growing and growing on a daily basis. When you look at the number of data centers being built just to handle this huge amount of growth, that's the way that we're seeing our customers consume this technology. It's not necessarily NTSC or PAL anymore. It's really, give me a data stream so I can visualize it wherever I am. And let's face it, we're kind of an on-demand society. We've got these devices that are on our hip or in our hand or in our pocket on a daily basis. We're an on-demand society. So we want our information where we are, when we are, on whatever device we have in our hands. And so being able to get it there in a real-time fashion is a really important component, I think, of this global security operations conversation.
I think getting the information there when you need it is an interesting thing, and COVID put that to the test a lot. When employees went home and the physical rooms couldn't be staffed, or we had to rethink about how they were staffed or where people were and the social distancing, and that presented a really interesting technological challenge, more so than it did anything else. And one of the topics that started coming up a lot in these global organizations was duty of care, and how we provide proper duty of care to our workforce, to our customers. How do we look at, protect our supply chain globally when we're now distributed, when we no longer have access maybe to our corporate network from where we are physically. And these organizations who historically maybe had these really large control rooms, and maybe they had one here and one there. And now we're starting to see, in some cases, smaller control rooms, more regionalized control rooms in different places that have built-in contingency and disaster recovery, but even more virtual. I mean, we're seeing GSOC operators working from home now. That was a thing a few years ago that nobody would have thought was acceptable. And technology sounds stupid, but the cloud have really enabled that changing landscape, because on a global basis, we think about somebody before mentioned geopolitical risk and what that means. We're going into what promises to be a really interesting election cycle in the US, and that has significant potential for disruption. We're having more severe weather, which has the ability to disrupt supply chain and people's abilities to operate. And so the GSOCs are starting to really step up and provide a lot more function for these organizations than just managing the guard force and access control and video. In the pharma world, if supply chain gets disrupted and they can't deliver medications and vaccines and things like that, then there's significant downstream implications, both financially for the business, but also for the general public. And so it's really been interesting to watch the seat at the table, I guess, that security in the GSOC has started to get in these organizations now that they're providing business critical functions versus just security functions.
So Ryan, preach on everything you just said. One of the biggest observations when people start asking about post-COVID is that concept of, before COVID, we were seeing a lot of fusion center development, right? A lot of multiple disciplines coming under one roof. And COVID taught us that a lot of people in a fixed space is bad. But then the other kind of maybe unintended, lesson that we learned out of COVID was that we can actually communicate from our home office, from our, from different locations. And so the technology's actually allowed us now to do the things that you were talking about in terms of, let's go back out to silos, but let's stay connected for collaboration, for collective decision-making, and what have you. The home-based operator is also one that we could probably have hours and hours worth of more conversations about, because I think, to your point, I think we've solved a lot of that problem technologically. But the one thing I would say, because it was also part of your question, was the duty of care. I think what we haven't necessarily solved is the operator experience in that home-based environment. We spent a lot of time and energy and money focused on ergonomics and visual acuity and operator comfort. And then we go, oh, you know what, tomorrow go work from your dining room. So there's definitely some work that needs to be done there. But yeah, in terms of workflow, we it's evolving for sure. And then the other piece of that you shared about, that the GSOC, however we define that space, is taking on more and more responsibility. I can remember a couple of years ago sitting into a session, I think it may have been at ISC West, talking about employee 411 and how that was a growing market within the GSOC because it's always staffed. And you wouldn't think that that's who you're going to call for, nuisance complaints or just general stuff where, hey, I don't know who to call, so I'm going to call them. But that's a non-emergency side of GSOCs, but it definitely has an impact on the overall operations, the stress, and the performance of that environment.
Highly functional GSOCs, the non-emergency function is like the number one thing that they do. It's not the sexy part of what they do, but it's actually the part that keeps the business running.
Well, I love that you guys have brought this up because I think it's sort. I don't know that hot button issue is the right term for it, but you start introducing a lot of external factors like remote operators and things like that, and maybe the answer is we have a pretty obvious distinction between mission critical and things like that, and nice to have, cool to have. But Tyler, I want to ask. They mentioned kind of the operator experience side of things and remote operation. My mind immediately says, okay, we've now sort of introduced a couple of different risk factors, into this. The primary one that sticks out to me is cybersecurity, right? We could say private VPNs and all these different things, but you talk about remote operation. How important is cybersecurity to that from a monitoring standpoint, and how are folks really leveraging a lot of the modern technologies to make sure that stuff doesn't leave the ecosystem?
Everybody's very concerned about their data, their entry points into the larger ecosystem that company has and basically relies on a daily basis for their operational component. So I think it's a huge concern for every customer that we're touching. In GSOCs, yes, with the distribution of employees and the need to reach out and conform and pull information from the field, it's a huge concern. I mean, let's face it. I mean, these large pharmas, they have dirty laundry. They don't need that dirty laundry getting out into the public marketplace. So that's a concern for them, and making sure that these facilities that we're supplying, these capabilities that we're supplying, are going to fit into their cyber posture. Big concern.
Well, and Ryan, kind of same question to that too. There's a lot of risk, not only just from a data aggregation standpoint, but you've got all these disparate sources that you're trying to integrate, right? That's one of the things that HiveWatch does a great job of is bringing all those together in one place. How do you streamline that to kind of that single source of truth while keeping all those disparate sources of information safe and secure versus those prying eyes?
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of our magic, and why people like us. But, I think first and foremost, there's not one right answer here. And we talk about different industries and critical infrastructure and government, and there's classified and unclassified, and none of these solutions are the right fit for everybody. There's certain industries and verticals where virtual and at home is never going to be viable. And then there's ones in tech and private sector where things do become more viable. But when we talk about shifting infrastructure to the cloud, that's also where you find a lot of the risk mitigated, because it's not about VPNing into all of these different networks and infrastructure. The stuff individually lives in the cloud, and where we get to play with that data and bring it all together is through cloud to cloud connectivity versus trying to have a complex network of APIs that connect to this on-prem stuff, and then you tunnel out to the cloud and you're increasing attack surface. So I think as more and more of the tools move to the cloud, that's also going to continue to make this workload and shifting the workload to virtual and remote and regionalized a lot simpler, just infrastructurally. But I also think it's going to decrease the attack surface for organizations, because it's not going to require people to remote into the company's network and on-prem infrastructure as much.
Well, look, that's you talk about those cloud to cloud connections, and obviously that's a fantastic way to transmit data. And I think one of the questions that naturally kind of comes up depending on who you ask, I guess, when you start talking about cloud is, okay, how do I leverage this to support things like AI interpretation of data and AI support and proactivity and response and all these different things. And Dan, I want to ask, this might be the laziest question I've asked of the day because everybody asks it, but it's worth asking. You talk about obviously cloud structure and things like that, but how does AI start to come into that? Whether it's predictive analytics, whether it's proactive response, how do you see a lot of those cloud sources and disparate sources as they come together for the operator, leveraging tools like AI to better not only respond, but proactively prevent some of these things?
So you're talking about this fad called artificial intelligence? It's a thing.
Never heard of it.
Go about it.
I heard color TV was a fad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, it's still an evolving landscape. AI has huge beneficial upside. It obviously also has a lot of nefarious potential as well. So there's that. There's both sides of that coin. We're seeing it be beneficial to the control room. It's in general, but the GSOC specifically around things like anomaly detection and other kinds of data points that are coming off of all these different edges, the sensor fusion concept, the automation of situational awareness. What it's allowing is more. And that's really what it's enabling. It's enabling more process, more procedure, more responsibility, more data, more sensors, more everything. What it's not doing necessarily, though, is taking the human element out of a control room relative to decision making or response. It's aiding that process, but it's not necessarily, it's not taking its place.
And I want to kick this to Ryan too. Ryan, obviously HiveWatch does a million things. We talked about a second ago with kind of integrating different data sources at high volumes and things like that. Say what you want about AI. AI has been leveraged in control rooms and technology for a long time, right? Whether that's facial detection, movement detection, AI has been around for a long time. But I think one of the use cases that Dan mentioned, data interpretation, really is one of the places that you're seeing our industry kind of collectively adopted at scale. How have you seen people leverage AI, and how do you anticipate seeing people leverage AI for things like that data interpretation at scale?
Well, first of all, I think AI has been poorly defined to a lot of the end users in the space. And so I think there's a significant number of people who think they're using AI and they're not. And it may just be a rules engine or something else. And that's fine. It's driving efficiency and it's making the program better, and that's great. But I just think as an industry, we've done a disservice by selling things as AI that are not truly talking about what's actually happening under the hood or in the product. And people are going to start getting dinged on that in information security reviews and things like that, because companies are getting wiser to the right questions to be asking in the diligence process as you're starting to look at vendors and evaluate tools around AI specifically. And one of those is the use of large language models for automation. But if you're built on a platform that is sending sensitive data out to an LLM provider, then there's inherent risk there to data and information. And so really thinking about the architecture of it, where the information's hosted, what data is getting sent out versus what is staying within the system. But the control room or the SOC of yesteryear and still a lot of what we see today is really highly inefficient, because the systems that are sending data, the signals, the alarms, the alerts, the things that the operators have to deal with on a daily basis are really dumb. And they're extremely high volume. And, when you look at access control alarms, like high 90% false alarm rate. And so you've got these people that are sitting there trying to stay on top of validating all of these alarms when most of them are false. Not only do you you risk missing the real event, but also just from a business dollars and cents perspective, you are literally lighting money on fire. And so that is one of the places where AI, where rules engines, where logic can really factor in to drive efficiency to the operator. Because if you can start freeing up the operator's time to not do meaningless menial tasks, they can now start taking on some of the more impactful true GSOC stuff. You can have less people, but a higher tier operator, or move from an operator to an analyst that can take on this broader function and go from a control room to really more of a true GSOC.
Well, look, at the end of the day, I mean, I love that you even mentioned it, right? The operator is kind of that single thread that is able to leverage a lot of these technologies and drive action. And Tyler, I want to give you the last word here. Tyler, we talk about that operator, and we've talked about that even several times on this show. But when it comes to GSOCs, especially modern GSOCs, and leveraging tools like AI, leveraging data visualization tools, data aggregation services, and monitoring, talk a little bit about that operator experience and why it's so important to continue to leverage those folks as we continue to advance technology and make things easier for folks.
Yeah, I think societally we're decades away from really moving into a truly robotic world. So the dependency on human decisions is going to continue for as long as I'll be around. So I think all of the enabling technologies that like HiveWatch provides, that we and the control room design integration world and the manufacturing world that Dan represents, I think it's incredibly important that we're synergized to make sure that those operators sitting in those rooms are highly effective. And, he designs rooms that are really easy for operators to function in. And as people move up that curve from a technical capability and potentially the scope of the work being performed within those spaces widens, that room is going to have to not only sustain not only time, but also be adaptable for new technologies, new platforms, new skill sets coming into those spaces. So the overall design and build of these rooms is not going to really change. It's only going to become more nimble, I think, from a technology offering standpoint. And again, all of these technologies, like what Ryan and his team are producing, help make the operators just that much more effective. And ultimately, we want them to be highly, highly effective. We need them to be very, very comfortable. That we need them to not be so comfortable they fall asleep, but we need them to be very comfortable in making good, quick decisions so that they're taking care of, my family, your family, and all those families we care about in our communities.
Well, Tyler, we lost your video there for just a second, but I think it still is worth that soundbite that you just gave. We talk about the operators obviously being kind of that single source of truth and really that ended the line for us. But I'll tell you what, gentlemen, to wrap up our conversation today, I want to give you each a chance to kind of put on your look into your crystal ball, so to speak, right? And ask how you see GSOCs, whether you want to call them GSOCs or whatever. How do you see the global security operations center market evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? And Dan, we'll go ahead and start with you on this one.
Well, we have a very different seat at the table. We're looking through a visualization and a collaboration lens within that space. So I can't speak as well to the technology, the overall workflow as Ryan and Tyler can, who are a lot closer to the end users. But I can tell you that from that perspective, it's about connectivity and giving them the tools to be flexible, yet at the same time designing products that are secure and that are going to be reliable, because uptime, it means the difference between, assets as well as people and lives. So I think for our purposes, we continue to harden product, but we continue to design, and hopefully I speak for the manufacturing community at large that is talking about products that are sustainable, reliable, and secure.
Ryan, would love to get your opinion. Same question. In 5-10 years, how are we going to continue to see the industry evolve?
I mean, I think in general, it's a massive up-leveling that's going to keep happening of the capabilities of the room and a shift of responsibilities. I think more of the sort of low-level tasks will be able to shift out to the edge, to the field, and not be required to be performed in the SOC. I think we'll see a lot of automation happening there across different platforms that helps, as we think about fusion or whatever you want to call it of these different technologies. And the function of the room is going to be a higher level person than just an operator who's clicking alarms and clearing things, but really focusing on the broader big picture and intelligence, because a lot of the other stuff will either be automated or pushed out to people that are decentralized.
And Tyler, will let you land the plane for us. Final word, 5-10 years, how's the industry going to look?
Has really kind of opened my eyes on some things, and his comments just now about raising the level of competency in these rooms and broadening the scope. I think that's a huge trajectory for this space. And again, the rooms are going to be there, and they're really important, they're really expensive rooms to build for a real estate organization. They're probably some of the most expensive rooms in any real estate portfolio. So making the best use of that space is really kind of interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how, with this continued AI and and everything moving into more of a standards-based type of approach or platform, how we can better leverage the investment in these facilities to better secure and not only our people and our assets, but now potentially our networks too. So kind of cool to think about it beyond just the physical security component.
Well, look, Tyler, Dan, and Ryan, we thank you so much for coming on the show today. Obviously, an incredibly important topic as we talk about the globalization, not only of the world of security, but the world of technology in general. I think this is a great place for a lot of people to learn and ask questions about some of those trends and topics as they continue to change. Look, if you have any questions for any of these folks, I know they're all on LinkedIn, very active. Find them on there. Feel free to ask them questions. They've got incredible insight that we didn't necessarily get to today. But gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe. Check us out again next time on the show.